Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where now that Patty Jenkins is officially returning for Wonder Woman 2, she can begin to put her team together. And like many of you, I was deeply disappointed, I'm going to go there, deeply disappointed that that team does not seem to include Allan Heinberg, who was the screenwriter on the first film. Now, every time I bring up his name, a number of you are very, very protective of Patty Jenkins' reputation, and you almost venomously go after Allan Heinberg's contributions and say, well, Patty Jenkins and Jeff Johns did a lot to rewrite that script. But I'd like to point out that even if the only thing that Allan Heinberg contributed to Wonder Woman 2 was the Disney princess formula being applied to Diana's early years on Themyscira, well, that alone makes him invaluable. That was a very clever angle, even though it was blatant. As I said, even from my trailer reactions for Wonder Woman, they were doing The Little Mermaid. They also had shades of Pocahontas in there as well. But it was really, really smart. And I think that it gave the film a warm, cozy, and family-friendly feel, and also a familiar feel, because it's a formula that's so beloved at this point. Whereas, a bunch of women living on an island together could have gone a very different way, and has gone a very different way. And I think that while you could certainly, admit that it wouldn't necessarily hurt the film, I don't think it would have been as commercially viable a film if you were to take a different approach as they have recently in the comics, for instance. And I also want to underscore, on that note in particular, that Allan Heinberg is an openly gay individual working in Hollywood, a member of the LGBT community, and Wonder Woman has long been an icon for that community and is beloved by that community. And in many ways, they have as much ownership over Wonder Woman as women and feminists do. So to kick that guy off of the sequel is just really disheartening. I think that he should be there for creative reasons, and I think he should be there for representative reasons. Now, they have replaced him with a straight screenwriter, and of course sexuality shouldn't come into play when you're hiring someone. I think it's an interesting factor. I think you should take into account everything about a writer when you're hiring them, but it's something that Wonder Woman, the first film, did have, and now it's lost. So that's the context in which I'm addressing it. And instead, they've brought on Dave Callaham. I'd also want to say on a side note, I'm sure many of you are like, because I just thought of that, many of you might be saying, well, maybe Allan Heinberg didn't want to return. Maybe Allan Heinberg's like, I got other stuff to do. He has a very successful television career right now, and he has written for the Wonder Woman comic. And I'd like to point out, I didn't like his Wonder Woman comic so much, but he did good with the movie. But I think that, what he contributed to the first film was so good, and so, I think, put the movie in the space that it needed to be a commercial hit, that I would have aggressively worked to keep him. So it's unfortunate that even if they amicably parted ways, that they did. So who did they get? Well, Dave Callaham has joined Wonder Woman 2, and his credits are ridiculous. He worked on the first Expendables, and he's credited ever since on the franchise because he created the characters. He also has a story credit on Godzilla, and he wrote 2005's Doom movie. Now, of course, you can't always be blamed for your earliest gigs. You need to take work. You need to get yourself on the board. You need to be a working writer. Forge the relationships to get to the better jobs. But that's a lot of bad with no good to point to, which I think is the real problem. Now, he was working on another screenplay for a movie called Jackpot, which, what do you know, Patty Jenkins was going to direct, and that was the first thing, that was her priority until, of course, she booked the Wonder Woman gig, and her career was changed forever. But she seems to be wanting to pull a lot of people through with her. Dave Callaham, seems instrumental in orchestrating him joining her team for the sequel. And also, of course, she's working on a show with Chris Pine for TNT, which we've discussed, which seems to largely be a way to get her husband a gig, Patty Jenkins' husband a gig. So I'm a little bit sad to see this go down this way. I hope that the sequel is good. I'm very nervous about it. It's not easy to make lightning strike twice. James Gunn was able to do it. But I don't know, we've seen others not be able to do it. I would say even Christopher Nolan wasn't able to do as good a job following up The Dark Knight with The Dark Knight Rises. I think that these things stress the collaborative process of movie making, and no individual should ever feel that they are the key ingredient or two individuals. In this case, I suspect Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot, that they're all that this movie needs. And again, I mean, this is, I continue to be upset about the lack of respect given to the male contributors for the first film, from Chris Pine to Allan Heinberg to Jeff Johns, right? I mean, it really does seem to have turned into the Patty Jenkins and Gal Gadot show, which is unfortunate because they both do such good work. I would hate for these stances to affect them negatively in terms of their reputations. But I'm curious to what you think of Allan Heinberg not being included. How do you feel about Wonder Woman 2 movie? I think we have a lot of questions that will come up about it in the next couple of months as it begins to take shape. One being, will it move away from Star Wars Episode 9? But of course, if it will be another period piece. We'll see. All right, so that's the first story of the day. Now, the second story of the day, talking about reputations. Jim Carrey, of course, his hasn't been doing so well, but he does indeed seem to be staging a comeback, and it's no accident that he was at Fashion Week making headlines. He's been making some unfortunate headlines, some tabloid headlines involving a past romantic relationship that ended in, tragically, a suicide. And it'll be interesting to see which of those headlines resurface when his new TV show does. Now, you might be like, oh, Grace, doesn't Jim Carrey already have a TV show? Yes, he's producing a show on Showtime, executive producing, called I'm Dying Up Here, about a group of stand-up comedians, and it just got renewed for its second season on Showtime, even though it's not a big breakout hit. But, Showtime is playing catch-up. Everybody talks about HBO and now Netflix and Amazon, and there's not a lot of discussion with Showtime. They had Homeland for a while, which really put them in the conversation, but that show has fallen away. I love Billions, by the way, Billions and The Affair. I mean, Showtime actually has some very good programming, but it isn't able to be part of like water cooler conversation, unfortunately. I'm including those two very, very good shows, Billions and The Affair. Love Billions so much. All right, so anyway, I'm Dying Up Here is executive produced by Jim Carrey, and his other executive producer on that is a gentleman named Dave Holstein. And Dave Holstein has come up with another show called Kidding, and it's going to star Jim Carrey. So very cleverly, Jim Carrey established a relationship with Showtime behind the camera, and since that went well, he's like, how'd you like to have me on camera? And Showtime says, no one's talking about us, we'll take it. I think this is actually a very good idea, and especially when you can add Michel Gondry to the mix, who of course worked famously with Jim Carrey on Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. He's going to be involved in this new show, and as is Jason Bateman as a producer, interestingly enough. And Jason Bateman's building himself a very nice little television empire there, not only with Arrested Development, but also, of course, Ozark. And Bateman will produce through his company, which has so far only done his films, I believe, and that's Aggregate Films. Now, this is going straight to series. They don't even have to make a pilot. I would put this straight to series as well. And I'm going to watch the heck out of it because I love Jim Carrey, and I think he's a very good comedian and a very good dramatic actor. As we were actually recently just discussing when I did the Downsizing trailer reaction, the new Matt Damon, Alexander Payne movie, I pointed out that it's so similar to The Truman Show. And I watched that I'd say maybe a year or two ago, and I just, again, Jim Carrey's acting really holds up. And of course, I enjoy him every year in The Grinch. So here he's going to play a Mr. Rogers type figure called Mr. Pickles. Interesting. Mr. Rogers hails from Pittsburgh, where my mother's family is from, so I always take an interest in Mr. Rogers' history. And here's a fun side note fact. Michael Keaton started out working with his career first off, behind the scenes on Mr. Rogers, and then did some cameos. So hilarious. Jeff Goldblum's from Pittsburgh as well. All right, so anyway, Jim Carrey's playing a Mr. Rogers type figure called Mr. Pickles, and he has a huge empire. He's been on the air for a long time. He's shaped a couple generations at this point. He's got a lot of merch, too. But then his family life begins to fall apart. His wife, his children, his brother and sister. It's a mess. Can't deal with it, especially while trying to protect his image. And his life begins to implode hilariously, and that sounds very, very good. And it's nice to see Jim Carrey return to the small screen. Of course, that's where he started with In Living Color. So I think this is a fabulous idea. I think Jim Carrey is a perfect fit for the small screen. And of course, this is the route, the route that's been, walked by a number of actors recently. I think most famously by Matthew McConaughey on True Detective to get their careers back on top. And so, again, Jim Carrey could have a problem with those headlines haunting him and coming back to get him, but we'll see what happens. And I'm curious if you think this is a good idea for Jim Carrey and for Showtime, and if you plan to watch it. All right, now, speaking of television shows, Netflix, we just mentioned them. Stranger Things made a very interesting headline yesterday, and that is the fact that well, I think interestingly enough, they're very aggressively planning a season 3 and 4. I don't know how long Stranger Things can go on, especially with it such a huge success, and there are such strong similarities between the two stories. But anyway, they want to shoot seasons 3 and 4 back to back because their cast is getting older and they want to get that stuff in the can before puberty hits. So this has led to 2 very interesting developments. Now, the first is that everybody's due for a pay raise. Now, this is, again, love it. This is so interesting. Even though this cast has been signed for 6 years. And how interesting is that? Signed for 6 years, going into something. I mean, I guess because they knew they had a long-term game plan and everybody here was a no-name talent. So you can say, you can put a 6-year contract in front of them. And they'll sign it. But just like Jennifer Lawrence did with the Hunger Games, the talent goes, are you really going to take the time to take me to court if I don't show up to work because you're not paying me enough, right? And that is apparently what the talent agents and the representatives for the entire cast is planning after season 2. So much so, they've openly admitted it to the trades. So right now, the 4 main kids, not including Will, who went to the Upside Down, but the 4 main kids from the first season, they get $30,000 per episode, and they also got bonuses. That's for season 1 and 2. But now they're going to be open to renegotiation. Everybody expects Millie Bobby Brown to renegotiate, aka 11. She's also in the upcoming new Godzilla movie. But at the same time, Finn Wolfhard has a strong case to renegotiate as well after his very strong turn in It. Although he will not be remaining with that franchise because, of course, they're going to an adult cast. And Stranger Things, if the negotiating gets too bad, they too could be like, we're going to just go to an adult cast. Forget this. But interestingly, they are having a merchandising situation, which is also really changing the Netflix inner workings. Because, right now Netflix is just trying to make sure they can just keep feeding, their insatiable audience content. Very smart business plan. It's working out great. But with Stranger Things, this is the first thing, and I love this quote that was used, it's moved the needle when it comes to merchandising over at Netflix. And they were quite surprised to see a number of knockoff merchandise for Stranger Things, or inspired by, and they were like, what? We should get in here. So they're building a new office at Netflix, which is going to be responsible for merchandising, particularly for Stranger Things, and they're going to start doing licensing deals, like for instance at Hot Topic. And they really want to play off of the Halloween angle because, of course, that's when season 2 is being released. So they want to have Stranger Things costumes and all kinds of stuff to really get people in the mood. And it'll be interesting to see if Netflix can create full verticals. Will this eventually go to theme park experiences, right? For instance, Halloween, there are a lot of mazes. Universal Studios has Haunted Halloween Nights. They're doing a Blumhouse-themed maze this year. Why not a Stranger Things maze? Or would an It maze be the hotter ticket? Although, of course, that's Warner Brothers. They might want to end up doing... Well, Warner Brothers has a good relationship with Universal because of the Harry Potter Wizarding World of Harry Potter theme park experiences. But, there's also the Six Flags, which Warner Brothers owns. But I think it's very interesting, and I'll be curious to see how Netflix handles this because they have a hard enough time just promoting their shows, although they've gotten very good at award season. So I guess when something needs to be done, Netflix learns real quick. And I don't think they feel they need to promote all that much because people do end up discovering their shows. All right, so that's the third story of the day, and I'm curious if you're interested in a Stranger Things season 3 and 4. Would you potentially want to see Stranger Things move to an adult cast? Do you think the cast is worth that amount of money? Do you think Millie Bobby Brown and or Finn Wolfhard can get more money for the next seasons apart from the rest of the cast? And do you want any Stranger Things merchandise, I guess, is a good question there as well. Then for the viewer question today, this comes from Ben Snedeker. And Ben Snedeker has a great question. So Ben Snedeker says, Grace, what does the distributor have to do with the success of a film that's already been made? For I, Tonya, which we discussed just the other day, going to Neon, the distributor Neon from Alamo Drafthouse. Although Alamo Drafthouse is having a lot of problems these days. I wouldn't want to be associated with them right now. A big PR mess with some sexual harassment allegations for an individual at the company who apparently was not fired. But anyway, I, Tonya, of course, went to Neon. So Ben says, if the movie is the same no matter what, no matter who picks it up, the movie doesn't change. More on that in a moment. What difference does it make? Won't it make the same amount of money, generate the same buzz, and the same award nominations? No, 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 Ben. Not at all. Your distributor is very, very important. So first off, the movie is the same no matter what. Well, that's Craig Gillespie's problem, and as we discussed, because Craig Gillespie won't cut his movie differently, a lot of distributors weren't interested in it. A lot of times, you show your movie and, if it's being acquired, if you didn't make it for a studio, as Ben pointed out the distinction here, sometimes they'll say, I like what you got here, but I want you to recut it a little bit. I think it could be tighter. I want to lose this scene, maybe extend this a little bit, maybe some reshoots even. But, I, Tonya refuses to do that, which is one of the reasons they went to Neon. And as I said in my coverage the other day, perhaps Craig Gillespie should have been open to a cut and he would have gotten a better distributor, which would make the following difference. So a distributor is a little bit like an airline. Now, for instance, you might wonder, why does it sometimes, for instance, in New York City, why is it when there's bad weather, JetBlue almost always is horribly delayed and can't get any planes off the ground? What the heck? They're a huge, huge company. They have tons of customers, and they're one of the biggest airlines coming out of New York City. Why would they have problems where other airlines do not? Well, there's only so much space on the runway, to take off. So the airport prioritizes the airlines that have more routes, particularly really, successful ones like international routes. So you go to an airport like JFK, and since JetBlue has a very small presence and it's only regional, they don't have to take nearly up as much traffic and generate as much business as something like American Airlines. So American Airlines gets priority. So when there's inclement weather and they have to cut back on the number of takeoffs there are, a bigger percentage goes to American. So that's the exact same situation with distributors. There's only so many movie theaters, and sometimes it gets super crowded, especially like award season, right? There's only so many specialty screens, and you want to make sure you get a lot of attention. There's only so much media coverage, etc., etc. So this is where a distributor comes in. So a distributor has a relationship with, for instance, the media. They have a very good, PR machine, and also even reviewers. Some some distributors are very good at handling junkets. They have experience in how to do that, who to invite, how to make sure it goes really well, what junket company to hire. There are companies, for instance, here in New York City, there's like one major company that runs most of the junkets. And when they're not doing the junket, you can really tell the difference. Then also, as the film continues on the festival circuit, Tonya is going to want to keep playing. The distributor has the clout to get the movie into the festival, get a good date, good time. Will it open the festival? Will it close the festival? Those are very important. The distributor has a lot of pull and say in what happens there because they have a relationship with the festival bookers. Then on awards season, the distributor has a good relationship with all the voters. How to hold an event. They have good event lists, a good Rolodex. So that's all there as well. They have a system in place. And Neon, which is where I, Tonya ended up, they're still building theirs. So it's you can see that like A24 has had a problem. An instance on a side note, Netflix has become very good at awards season, and some people say to the point where maybe they should be reined in by the Emmy, the board that runs the Emmys, because some people feel that Netflix is maybe cheating a little bit by spending so much money and having these huge events. But anyway, back to distributors. They also have a relationship with theaters. So when it's really crowded and all these awards season movies are starting to go in, Fox Searchlight can say, hey, I have a great relationship with, there's a great theater here in New York City. Like there's a City Cinemas that runs like the Angelica and the Paris Theater. For instance, the Paris Theater will run every Harvey Weinstein movie. That's his. He's called dibs on it. If there's a Weinstein Company movie, for like 90% of the time, it plays at the Paris Theater. And sometimes for way too long. But there's a Lincoln Plaza Cinemas, which is a big awards theater. A lot of small movies go there. And because a lot of people who are awards voters on the Upper West Side, they gravitate towards that theater. So if you have a good distributor, they have a relationship and they say, I want my movie to be a big deal. I don't want just one screen. I want 2 or 3 screens. So when people look up at the marquee, they're like, oh, look at the momentum that this movie has. It's playing on 3 screens. That means there's a lot of demand. You want to create that sense of demand. So that's what you want. You really want something that has a good footprint and good relationships. And that all boils down to the distributor. And the same thing goes for the bigger pictures as well. That makes a very big difference. Look at how Sony does in terms of their image and their relationships, and Disney. Like Disney's a juggernaut. Disney has they have a release machine in place. And for instance, we also talked about how Sony doesn't have a great relationship with China, but Disney can get a day-and-date release in China for their movies. And they have a very good relationship, the Disney company, with the Chinese government. And of course, the Chinese government runs the film division. So these all make a huge, huge difference. So the distributor makes a very big difference, and we'll have to keep an eye on Tonya to see how it works out for them I think they would have been much better off if they had ended up even with Amazon. Netflix, I think, they were right to pass up a Netflix deal, but I think Amazon would have been better. I think they would have been very good with Lionsgate, and of course, Fox Searchlight and Sony Pictures Classics remain like the creme de la creme of award season. But we'll see what Neon's able to do. All right, so that's my answer to your question, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. Please write down below what you think of today's top 3 stories, Ben's viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered on Monday, and any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching.